the budget was important for the electorate and for George Osborne, the Chancellor, in terms of determining the roadmap ahead. The public aren't going to pick up much of the detail in the budget, but of course George Osborne politically and quite cleverly gave them some red meat, which was of course the cut in fuel duty, which 66% of motorists said they supported. And, you know, I don't think George Osborne did himself any harm, quite frankly, with that budget. Not a lot of great news for people, but to be honest, they're not expecting much. And, you know, you have to remember the overarching picture for this government is not about how people feel in 2011, how they feel in 2012, or indeed even how they feel in 2013. It's all about making them feel a bit better in 2014-15. George Osborne was the most popular Conservative Chancellor we have ever seen. We've been tracking the reputation of individual Chancellors of the Exchequer since the 1970s, and at the time of his first budget, his emergency budget, George Osborne was the most popular Conservative Chancellor we've ever seen in the honeymoon period after the formation of the coalition. Now, since then, of course, as he himself expected, his popularity has declined, but he's still doing rather better than Norman Lamont or Ken Clarke and certainly John Major. What we found at the moment is that in terms of Ed Balls versus George Osborne, the public are completely split. Although they believe that the Conservatives overall have better policies on the economy, it's a fine line, but a few more percent believe that the Conservatives are better than Labour on this. When they look at the two men, Balls versus Osborne, it's basically even Stevens, with people completely divided over which one would be better. And it will be interesting to see, you know, how Ed Balls does as Shadow Chancellor. Will he be able to sort of appeal to the public or show some convincing alternative? Personally, I feel that Labour does have a very tough sell on this because, you know, it is absolutely the case that if they had won the election, they would have had to make quite deep cuts, at least 80 or even 90% of the cuts that the Conservatives are now making. Yes, of course, they'd say they'd take longer, but it's a very difficult message. Their core supporters are often in denial about the need to make cuts at all. The voters as a whole sort of don't like cuts, but will sort of go along with it. And so saying, well, my cuts wouldn't be quite as bad as your cuts, it's not a very snappy message, is it? At the moment, people still blame the Labour government for the cuts. And the global economic situation, but it's by 51%. The majority of people still blame the previous government more than the global situation or the banks. For readers or people watching this in local government, only 1 person in 20, when offered local government, those wasteful scoundrels in local government as a candidate for cuts, we didn't ask the question quite like that, blames local government. So local government isn't blamed, even though a lot of the rhetoric currently emanating from communities and local government and from the Secretary of State is that local government's terribly wasteful. Local government doesn't get particularly fingered as being responsible for this state of affairs. I mean, and if we're brutally honest, people have always thought local government was pretty inefficient. You know, in local elections, what tends to happen is that people vote on national issues. At the moment, in most of the polls, the Conservatives are doing, and the coalition are doing slightly less well. The Lib Dems, of course, are, you know, below half, in polling terms, half the actual share of the vote that they achieved at the general election. We're also, of course, in terms of the political cycle, at a high watermark in terms of Conservative control of local councils. So the Conservatives control every single county council. They control Derbyshire County Council, you know, which has been Labour for a very, very long time. And I think the place we're in at the moment, in terms of the level of Conservative control that they're trying to defend, or the councils they're defending, is a little bit like Labour's position in 1997. Remember, in Labour won Reigate and Banstead in Surrey. Now, this is not the natural home of the Labour Party, and at the moment, the Conservatives control a number of places that are certainly not the natural home of the Conservative Party. So what I would expect to see in May is, particularly if the cuts become unpopular or more unpopular, the government behind in the polls, you should see Labour starting to take control of more councils. There's a complicating factor if it's combined with the AV referendum in terms of turnout on that, because that might actually boost turnout. That, certainly in London, of course, was one of the reasons why Labour took control of a number of councils in May of last year, even though nationally the vote was going against them, because the raised turnout brought out the sort of Labour voters who don't normally bother. But no, Labour should start to take control of more councils, and you know, at some point during this Parliament, or certainly in the next few years, you would expect Labour, for example, to take back control of the Local Government Association. There will be a swing as all governments suffer from political gravity. They will become less popular, and they're certainly going to have some difficult periods ahead, some very tough times. So Labour ought to do well. I do think, and the Lib Dems, in theory, because of their problems centrally, and because of Nick Clegg being seen as having reneged against his promises, the local Lib Dems are going to be trying to say, nothing to do with us, Gov. In a little bit, almost as though Boris in London will be in 2012 when it's time for his re-election, will probably be saying a few things against the government to show that he's very independent-minded, even if he is a Conservative. So I think, but generally, it's not going to be good news for the coalition. I'm not sure they're expecting it to be, quite frankly, and it's going to be tough. I think the fact that their own Secretary of State seems to spend so much time saying how useless councils are, most of whom are controlled by Conservative politicians, is a little difficult for them as well. And one thing that we have to remember is that there is a correlation between how much people like their local council and how much they like the government. Partly because of the level of confusion people have over which service is provided by which layer. Remember, about a quarter of people in Britain believe local government runs the benefit system because of housing benefit. They're just confused. And so when government becomes less popular, so does local government. So the process of not only is central government going to be in a position of declining popularity, but it's also actually rubbishing local government, which will actually, in theory, speed up its own decline. And I think that must be a real challenge for Conservatives in the sector. Well, I think there's a central tension in terms of the government's position on localism. And it's one, to be honest, that all governments of the last 20 years have faced, that most of them have talked about letting go. I mean, you can look at the speeches of previous Secretaries of State like Hazel Bliss or David Miliband, and you will see loads and loads of rhetoric in there about empowering local people, removing the dead hand of the state, etc. None of them quite want to do it. And the reason for that is that ultimately local government has very little that's good in it for central government. Local government is a source of contagion and problems for central government. It can actually make you get kicked out of power, as the poll tax showed. It's very toxic, but it doesn't have much good news. So the main thing is to sort of keep it under control. So while the new government doesn't like much of the apparatus and bureaucracy that it saw under Labour, at the same time it doesn't seem to be feel quite able to sort of having scrapped things like the Audit Commission, it still doesn't seem quite able to take its arguments to their logical conclusion, which is that if you believe in localism, then local government needs to be allowed to decide things. If you say, as Grant Shapps does, that ultimately the local ballot box ought to be the deciding factor, then to a certain extent you have to decide, what are you going to lay off and just let them get on with, and what are you going to impose? And I think there is a tension between saying that, they're completely free and then making a series of announcements castigating them over virtually everything if they do things you don't like. The whole point about localism is that things that people at the centre don't like may happen, but presumably it has to be up to local people to change. And the central tension here is, of course, that the British electorate believes that, always says in surveys that it believes that local people should have much more control over how local priorities are set. Do you want to pay your executives a lot or build new things, or what do you want to do? But at the same time is also very keen on ensuring that standards of services are the same everywhere in Britain. 91% want NHS services to be the same everywhere. And, lots of people would like refuse collection to be the same everywhere. Indeed, it appears that Eric Pickles would like, a localist, would like refuse collection to be at least once or twice a week everywhere. And in fact, when we offered people in an opinion poll the option of having the grass in parks centrally controlled and mandated to be only a certain length, they'd like that too. So in a sense, politicians are caught in this trap of the public sort of schizophrenia, or our favourite word round here, cognitive polyphasia, the ability to think conflicting things about the same thing at the same time with no apparent dissonance. So the public want their cake and eat it. They want the dead hand of government to go away when they don't want it, but they'd also quite like it there to guarantee things if they can. And one of the central debates that is not resolved in this country is what the de minimis standards should be everywhere. Should they be set centrally? The public probably believes there should be some de minimis standards, but nobody really wants to define exactly what those are. Or do we believe that actually, no, it should be left up to localities? And if people, in one area don't get Herceptin and people in another area do get Herceptin, that's fine. people like Francis Maud say that, of course, that's absolutely right, that the word postcode lottery, so loved of Daily Mail leader writers, is, of course, a nonsense. There always have been postcode lotteries and there always will be. That may be true, but the public don't like having that terrible fact pushed in their faces. They like to imagine that somebody somewhere will guarantee that everything will be all right. And that, ultimately, takes precedence over localism.